Okay, let's try to understand two different areas in this binding API. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create here a couple of text boxes. So let's put up here other simple boxes just to define the area or territory. So we have, let's say, one area, and let's call this area as in CLR's area. And we will have one more area, let's call this area as in area of WPF runtime. Okay. Now, just to ensure that we understand it, what I'm going to do is I'll mention this as CLR's area. And just to understand this is other area, let's understand this as WPF runtime's area, ultimately managing the UI. Okay, now here who owns what kind of a content? So what we will do is we will try to understand programmatically what we did some time back. We created one entity called as EMP, of which I created EMP1 as an object, which had a name property which I assigned to value called as Mahesh, which also had a property called as age which I assigned to 40. And then this particular object was assigned as a data context to the entire window. So WPF runtime, when represented the UI, you saw the visual tree hierarchy some time back. And what was that hierarchy look like? It had something called as window 1. Then window 1 had something called as, just to understand, border. Border had something called as add-on decorator. Then add-on decorator had something called as stack panel. And then there was a huge hierarchy after this. So there was like hierarchical elements one after another like this. And after much complex hierarchy, somewhere here there was this txt name box, and which had some property which was ultimately called as text property, which we tried to bind with something called as name, which is obviously coming from data context, that is EMP1 in this case. Now, on the click of the button, what we observed was whenever any change happens in the text box's text, immediate reflection in case of employees name property or age property. So in a way, what was working was this. There was by default any change happening in the UI here was ultimately allowing the change in case of name property over here. So this was working one way. This is called one way towards source. So here CLR ultimately, or CLR object, is acting as a source over here. So this is acting as a source property. And here right now in WPF, whatever we see, this is acting as something called as target in here. So what happens is whenever target changes or target content changes, immediate reflection is what you see in UI or in case of source. But the reverse was not working. So something that we need to understand again, this change over here, it wasn't working at all. So this is something which is creating a problem for us. So I'll just mention here, this is something which is not working. And then we need to understand why it is not working. So from the source, target is not changing. Again, whose responsibility is it to basically find out where to change? Which means if at all, I have specifically said that between these two, what exists is, just to understand the content, between these two there is a binding API that we have here in both the cases. So we have binding API connecting these two ends. So the problem that we have now is why the other part is not working. That is why change in the name in the source is not changing anything in case of target. There is a reason. Whose responsibility is it to change anything in the target? You will find out that is going to be a clean responsibility of somebody called as WPF runtime. Okay, now what exactly comes under WPF runtime, or what exactly comes under that responsibility? See, changing the name in case of text box is not a concern, but just see to it that is this text box is not at the simple location like third location. You will find out this text box is actually at hierarchy like maybe 15th level, or if the complex UI you have, it can be nth level. So you will find out this hierarchy WPF runtime will have to go through whenever change happens in case of source, and then that WPF will have to find out that there is a text box which has a text property which is bound with name. I should change this particular content, and then WPF runtime can very well go and change it. Now, finding the element inside this visual tree hierarchy and then changing the respective property, it itself is a tedious job. But what if I tell you that is WPF runtime is already having this code written? Okay, which means finding the text box and understanding it has to change the text property and making the changes in the UI, you will find out all these things are already there in WPF runtime. Okay, then why it was not working? The problem was at CLR's end, which means who was at fault sometime back was this guy. So you'll find out CLR is something which is at fault right now, because whenever any property changes in case of CLR, CLR is ultimately not telling here to the WPF runtime that is, this is something which I change and you should also change in the UI. So CLR is not telling this to WPF runtime. Okay, when CLR is not telling, in the sense our code, which is our employee class that we have authored, this class is not somehow capable to convey to WPF runtime that I change, you also change. Okay, when I said something like WPF runtime already has a code written with respect to changing the UI, changing the UI with respect to the source change. What do I mean by that? It means WPF runtime already has the code written in the form of event handler. So you will find out WPF runtime already has a code written for this in the form of in the form of event handler. Okay, and it's like you already have a button click code written, but if you don't click on the button, the code won't execute. Now exactly in the same manner, right now what happens is this particular event handler which WPF has is already there, like finding the control and changing the respective value. The only concern that we have is our code, which is this particular EMP class or this particular object, is not ultimately raising the event against which the event handler needs to execute. So the problem that we have is this particular EMP class is not raising the event which is responsible for handling the event. And ultimately, since event handler is already there, WPF runtime can very well go and make sure that the changes happen. So ultimately what we have to do is we will have to, through code, we will have to raise here one event. So we will have to convey here raise event so that WPF runtime can make the changes. Okay, so maybe I should raise event and I should write here so that WPF runtime can do change. Change in UI. And this is something which is missing from the code right now. And that's the reason you will find out it's very, 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 what we call it as unethical. That is, WPF runtime has got so many things automatically done for us. Like any change case, in case of UI change, it tells me that, I change, you change. But reverse is not working. So WPF runtime is not the one we should blame. So ultimately our code has to change so that we can see the things are going to go and change properly. So we have to handle this kind of an event so that we can tell WPF runtime it's time to execute the code, find the control and change the respective property of the control. Okay, which event are we supposed to do and supposed to execute? So in order to understand that, in WPF there's one very, very standard kind of event. So your class ultimately will have to implement one event which is called as notify property change or property change. So you have to write a code for property changed event. So ultimately raise property changed event, and this raise property change is going to go and come from some interface which is well known as INotify property changed. So this particular what we call it as interface is going to go and help us achieve this thing. So what we are going to do now, we are simply going to implement one interface which will hand over one event to us, and that particular event is going to help us change or make the changes in the UI. So hopefully we are clear with some basic things about WPF, visual tree, then logical tree, and at the same time why the code was not working when I changed something in the UI, why it was not reflecting in case of source. So what we have to do is, the changes in the source was not reflecting in the UI. So we need to understand why. Now we understand like why it is not working. Now let's see the demonstration by implementing INotify property change.